welcome to the Earthkeepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earthkeepers community, that includes our spiritual lives. Welcome, friends, to the Earthkeepers podcast. Hey, Earthkeepers. In these times of environmental crisis, it becomes crucial for us to think innovatively, even experimentally, to find ways to protect and advocate for the earth. Well, recently, my friend Ben Lowe, director of Arusha USA, connected me with a chap named Paul Dettman, founder of an Australian organization called Cassinia. In his work with that organization, Paul is exactly the sort of creative, risk-taking, out-of-the-box kind of earthkeeper who can serve as an inspiration to all of us. You see, Paul and his teammates at Cassinia are modeling a way of thinking and being called environmental entrepreneurship, and that's what we'll be talking about in this episode. So buckle up and maybe have a notebook handy, because I'm hoping that when you hear Paul talk about the work of Cassinia, you'll be inspired with some new ideas of your own for more effective earthkeeping wherever you are in the world. Paul, thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule, I'm sure, to share with us about your experiences in leading Cassinia. I've honestly been really looking forward to this conversation, as you'll understand as we talk. So welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Boris. And I've heard a little bit about your work and love to know more. It's great to be able to cross-pollinate with people who are like-minded around the world.
Absolutely. Well, Paul, perhaps you could orient our listeners by giving us at least a general sense of what Cassinia is about.
Yeah. So Cassinia is a 23-year-old company based in Central Victoria, Australia. And if you put our big picture goal up, it's to see 30% of the continent of Australia managed for conservation. But that's 30% of each ecosystem. So it's not to take a 30% chunk out of the desert and say we did it. That's been our goal since we started. And it's interesting that the Global Biodiversity Framework that was signed in Montreal a couple of years ago really follows that same goal. So we feel like validated, but it's a big goal. So we're partnering with lots of other organizations in Australia to do that. So I guess that's where we're at. We purchased probably about 70 properties in Australia. In our state, we're the largest covenanting partner of our equivalent of a land trust, a group called Trust for Nature. So we're on the way and we're doing some good work. There's still a lot to do. But if I take a step back even more, the goal of Cassinia is to see people and nature flourish. And I think this is where we could get into some really interesting details, is like, how do we see nature flourish and how do we see people live to their full potential alongside that flourish? From what I see, Circlewood and Earthkeepers, that's what you're really pressing into as well.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I've had the pleasure of listening to some YouTube recordings of talks that you've given. And frankly, you strike me as this massively creative person who knows how to make things happen. I think it would be great if you could share with our listeners maybe the story of how Cassinia came about.
Yeah, that's a good place to start. And I'm part of a great team, and I look at the thread that I am in that team and think, well, I'm a particular color of thread in the tapestry. It'd be a pretty boring tapestry if it was just my color. So I do shout out to the rest of our team because they are amazing. But yeah, just go back. Like, I often go right back to the start. I've grown up on a family farm, 6th generation on a family farm, and our family moved to Central Victoria in like the 1840s, which is pretty early for Victoria. Was only really settled in the 1830s, so it was pretty early. My dad was a bit of a conservationist. Soil conservation was a big thing, and I think in the US and Australia in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And he won some awards for his work and locked up some country for nature pretty early on. So I grew up in that enabling environment. I went to university, studied agriculture, and then got offered a scholarship to do a master's looking at the intersection between nature and agriculture. And I was interested in that beforehand. And being offered to do that master's really galvanized my leaning into nature. finished that master's in 98, and then in 2000 was forming this idea about Cassinia, which we really set up as a company 2002, 2003. That was the beginning of the journey, and it was the start of the carbon conversations, and we went to a lot of landholders and said, what if we could plant trees for free on your land? What would that look like? So we started doing that, and between 2003 to 2008, we were working on other people's land, calling up farmers. I knew a lot of farmers, so I'd just call people up and say, hey, have you got any areas of erosion you need stabilized or some degraded land? And it was pretty easy to get farmers to just go, yeah, I've got 100 acres or 50 acres or 20 acres or whatever. And then in 2008, we had a bit of a switch. We had to, in order to generate any sort of carbon, we actually had to put the agreements on title. And so it was one thing for farmers to say, yeah, you can come and work on my land. It was a different thing to say you could actually put an encumbrance on the land title. And so all our work dried up, and we were like, oh, maybe we shut the company down, or I don't know. And then we actually mortgaged the house. My wife was very, very trusting. We bought a piece of land so we could put the encumbrance on the land as we did the environmental restoration work. And it's funny to think back now because it was such a big moment, like, will this work? And, am I stupid to do this? And it's become our normal model now to purchase land and do this. But in 2008, it was a big deal.
Could you maybe explain what encumbrance is? I know what they mean in our context, but how does that make a difference then?
Well, basically, for us, it means that we're going to put a dealing or an instrument or a contract on the land title. So if you were to buy this land off me, you'll buy it with a conservation easement, I think would be what you'd use the term in the US. You'd buy it with restrictions that say this is basically conservation land from now on. So if you had aspirations for agriculture or anything else, sorry, this is conservation land. We didn't have to do it with the whole of the land. Like the farmers that we were working with, we could have just taken maybe 5% or 10% of their land, whatever they were willing to give up. We didn't have to put it over their whole property or anything. But people are just nervous about casting a solid, unmovable future for a piece of land when they might decide to do something else in the future.
But by encumbrances, you weren't exactly locking it away against any future use. I mean, I'm imagining you're rewilding in ways that farmers could continue to use the land, yeah?
That's correct, but on the areas that we're protecting, they wouldn't be grazing livestock anymore. This would be like the primary goal of the management of this land is for nature. So anyway, so we purchased land and we started doing it ourselves. And so the model flipped from being calling up people and having lots of, work happening on other people's land to us buying land. We started down a new trajectory. And since 2008, I think we've purchased maybe 70 properties throughout sort of southeastern Australia. So our state, Victoria, New South Wales, which is north of us, which is where Sydney is, and then across to South Australia, where Adelaide is, sort of halfway across the continent. We've now purchased properties throughout those three states. So in that journey of purchase, we've engaged with other, I suppose, environmental markets. Mitigation banking is a thing that happens in the US, and that happens over here as well. But it's a bit more comprehensive than the US in that it sort of covers any impact on nature, not just wetlands and specific species, like any impact on nature. So,
and by banking that credit, how does that look like in your system?
Yeah, so in our system, if you've got a development and maybe a road or maybe a highway is going to be expanded or something, anything that impacts any nature, even if it's like, I want to cut down a tree in my backyard and it's a native tree, that is an impact. So everything is captured. You'll have to get a permit, and in order to get that permit issued, you've got to have made good somewhere else. So we sort of leaned in. We've got the restoration for carbon stuff that we've been doing for a while now. This is back in 2008. And then we start seeing, an opportunity to buy land and protect it and generate these other sort of mitigation credits.
And so if a developer wanted to, say, clear a lot and put a couple of houses there, and he wanted to bank that mitigation that he would need to put into place, do you as an organization help them to do that? Do you provide them opportunities?
We don't know. They could do that themselves, but that's not our part. We're about going into the landscape and thinking about what does this landscape need to look like in the future? Which areas should we be purchasing and protecting? And what mechanisms, and restoring, and what mechanisms can we use to do that? So we're less about coming alongside existing landholders and helping them with that as being the architect of the restoration ourselves. And, there's other people who do what you're saying, and that's great, and we support that. But our piece has been this. So that's led us to that side of the market. And then we've developed a project called wilderlands.earth, like wilderness, but wilderlands.earth. And then we're leaning into, okay, how can we take all the learnings that we've done in this compliance regulated market? How can we bring that to the aspirations of, say, the Global Biodiversity Framework, where companies are thinking about what it means to be nature positive and what it means to give back to areas that have been historically cleared. Maybe there's no need for permits now, but there's been an impact in the past. And how do we bring a simple, people-centered and nature-centered way of doing restoration voluntarily? So Wildlands.earth has been that foray, and it's been a really interesting journey to go on. Is nature restoration, is biodiversity going to become another market alongside carbon, or are these two markets going to merge and we're going to be thinking about sort of broader landscape, nature, biodiversity in one thought? Anyway, so that's led us to that journey as well. So we're still doing restoration work based around carbon. I mean, it's nature restoration and carbon's the metric that we use to measure it. We're doing protection in compliance with different state and federal approaches. We've got this voluntary biodiversity thing we're leaning into. And then we don't hold on to land forever. So when we purchase land, we're thinking about who's the future steward of this, and what does future stewardship do for people, and how do we bring community together in a way that can do good for people as well as nature. So we've got a land component to what we do, and we're calling it natural communities. So communities based around nature, and then we've got communities with agriculture in the mix too. So natural agriculture communities. And there's a couple of models there that we're leaning into. We won an award about 18 months ago for some of that thinking around bringing people, agriculture and nature together. So that's the components of what Cassinia is. I mean, we've got a big picture view of the idea of human flourishing and nature flourishing together, but then it gets deconstructed into these markets that we're trying to make the thing work around. So I don't know if that gives you a bit of a summary.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll drill down into some of those ideas, which I think are fascinating. But I want to ask you first, most of us who are committed to earthkeeping in some way are really motivated by love and sustained by our connections to nature. I wonder if you have a story that you could share, maybe even from your childhood, that characterizes your relationship with nature.
Oh man, this is a good one to think about, Forrest. What a great question. The story that comes to mind, and it's probably not the story I'd land on if I have enough time, but we purchased a property maybe 10 years ago or maybe 12 years ago, and it was pretty remote. I knew there was some Indigenous heritage associated with the property. We knew there was a long history of First Peoples living in the area. And I went to this property, and it's remote enough that there's no sounds apart from nature in this area. And you talked about, before we jumped on the call, about your restoration of prairies. And this is a grassland restoration project for us. So it's different to the forest systems we probably more typically work in. And so I'm out in this property, and it's pretty wide open, and it's in a fairly natural state on a small creek that is all treed. And I'm in this little enclosed area with trees around because the creek's sort of winding, and no sounds of road or humans at all because it's pretty remote. And I just felt this piece of nature come on me, like being enveloped by love from nature. And I just felt so warm and welcome in this space. And it was a spiritual moment for sure, a feeling enveloped. And then I was like, I bet that First Peoples would have felt this same sacredness to this space, this same embrace of this space. And I looked down as I thought that, and I saw a midden, like a cooking mound that I'd never seen before. And there it is. It's like this place would have been used for thousands of years for people to be embraced by nature and in time off into the distant non-recorded past. And so that's one small example. I mean, I feel that nature fills the cup in so many ways like that, and God through nature fills the cup. And so in that moment felt a connection to humanity in the past, to the Creator, and to the creation. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that story. It's beautiful. Thank you. Appreciate that. Well, there is just so much to Cassinia, and I know we won't touch on all of it in our short time here, but I do want to ask you about some things about Cassinia that really makes your approach to earthkeeping different and unique. And as an organization, Cassinia is clearly committed to experimenting with new approaches to earth care and asking questions that maybe some organizations aren't asking or even know to ask. So honestly, it's those places that you are pushing the creative boundaries that I personally find most inspirational, and I hope our listeners will too. I'd like to start maybe with this concept of reimagined entrepreneurship, which really in my mind sets Cassinia apart from other earth care organizations. Here's why I'm intrigued, just to give you some background. Until a few months ago, I was a professor of community development, and one of the courses I would teach every year was called social entrepreneurship. And just to clarify for our listeners, in that course, my students would learn about ways to work for the social good by engaging business principles and practices, and we called that social entrepreneurship. And that model would stand really in contrast to maybe an organization that relies solely on grants or charity to empower their work for social change. So you might, for example, have a nonprofit that engages in income-generating activities to support their work with community healthcare in Chicago. Or to give another example, you might work to combat poverty in rural Africa by helping women to establish cooperative savings group in their village and help them fund their own projects like, water collection or school for kids. So that's how I understand social entrepreneurship. Now, what really intrigues me is this related phrase that I saw on your website called environmental entrepreneurship, which people use to describe you and the work of Cassinia in general. Perhaps you could give our listeners a sense of what environmental entrepreneurship is, and maybe help us to understand what new possibilities it represents for engaging earth care.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I feel like social entrepreneurship sits alongside environmental entrepreneurship in the way we think about things too. And just to hopefully not waste too much time, but step a little bit back, Cassinia Environmental has been around, like I said, about 20 years, but we've also recently started a thing called Cassinia Community, which is probably leaning more into the social entrepreneurship. Well, definitely leaning more into the social entrepreneurship than the environmental, and is precipitating about half a dozen social entrepreneurship projects. So I love that, the way you're going with that thinking. We give ourselves license in the entrepreneurship space to try things that we're not necessarily deeply proficient in, working on the assumption that our distinct other experiences could feed into areas in creative ways that perhaps people who have been incumbent in that space for a long time haven't thought about. So we're thinking about some education work, and we're doing some stuff with refugees, and we're thinking about reconciliation a little bit differently with First Peoples and regular Australians. And I feel like the fact that we're not deeply, embedded for decades in those spaces gives us a bit of creativity in the entrepreneurship space. So I feel like that we get really interesting and creative. But when it comes back to the actual crux of your question, environmental entrepreneurship, I feel like the environment space has been domain of nonprofits for a very long time. And that's sort of the way we do things. And, I had another business before I started Cassinia that I started while I was in college. And so I had this sort of yearning for being entrepreneurial and doing things a bit different. And then to start a for-purpose, but not a non-profit, a for-profit purpose company in the environment space, like in the early 2000s, just meant that we had to be creative. Like, where do we find these threads that can make this thing work? And hiring innovative, creative people, and then as these markets for nature and for carbon are sort of developing, how do we bring a redemptive entrepreneurial lens to those, so we're not just trying to exploit the markets to make profit, but how do we bring that social entrepreneurship lens to environment? And I feel like it's a mindset, like we've never received philanthropic grants. Everything's got to have a way to cover its own costs. It makes us nimble, makes us quick to move. You know, when opportunities present, we get on them quickly because we need to make this work. Yeah, I don't know if I'm answering your question the way you think, but I feel like that's what we bring, yeah.
And it raises the question, I mean, does Cassinia call itself a business or a nonprofit?
No, we call ourselves a business, like a for-purpose. We are actually a registered social enterprise. So most of our profit goes either into the cause or gets given to charities that go about our bigger mission, which is people and nature flourishing. So we could almost be a nonprofit, but the flexibility of being in the marketplace is good. You can raise capital, you can act quickly. The nimbleness of for-profits is really valuable. And not to take anything away from nonprofits, because the big players in Australia in our space are still nonprofits. WWF, Bush Heritage, Australian Wildlife Conservancy, they're doing a lot of work in conservation in Australia. But having smaller organisations like us in the mix too is an important part, because there's things that we can do that they can't do too. In the social and the environment space, I think it's critical to have a mix of approaches and nimbleness and types of capital. Yeah.
Yeah, so all of this really resonates with me deeply, and maybe I can explain why. I'm currently director of an ecological restoration nonprofit called Pacific Rim Institute of Environmental Stewardship, and we do work that is in some ways similar to Cassinia, but on a much smaller scale. Our work focuses mostly on the restoration of prairies and Gary Oak savanna biomes, which are native to the Pacific Northwest. When I say we work on a much smaller scale, though, that doesn't mean that we couldn't be doing a lot more, since there are plenty of places where we are, especially in the islands, where we need to do the work of ecological revitalization and protection. To be honest, I would say our one most limiting factor is money. That's money to hire the people we need to do the work, money to secure the resources that we need to take on more projects. Now, I will say that at Pacific Rim, we do have a significant business component that supports the nonprofit. We collect and process native seeds and grow prairie plants as well. And then we sell those to other environmental organizations to kind of empower their own restoration work. But those profits actually do factor into our income stream and support us to a significant extent. But mostly, like so many nonprofits, we rely on individual donations and grants to a pretty big extent. And, you know, those sources barely cover the work that we're already committed to doing. And to be honest, now that President Trump and Elon Musk are dismantling government agencies that provide some of those grants, we're actually quite nervous about the future viability of our work. So I'll say that when I look at really the amazing creative projects that Cassinia is engaged in, to be honest, I feel a little bit inadequate, and I start to wonder if I just lack the imagination to think about alternative, more entrepreneurial ways to support our work of ecological restoration. And I would imagine that I'm not alone, that probably lots of people in situations like mine maybe seek your advice. Using me as a case example, maybe what would you say to environmental nonprofits or nonprofits in general when it comes to reimagining entrepreneurship?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts immediately come to mind. And one is that you'll have a lot of stakeholders in your community and in your wider networks that will share the same aspirations as you. And thinking about how do you contribute to them realizing their goals, and what does that look like then from a business perspective? Because there's plenty of money in the economy, and if you can find a way for nature restoration and caring for our home and restoring our home in the broader sense, and embed that in the way companies think about what they do, that's the sort of thinking. Somebody said the other day, effective communication always begins by starting where the other person is. What's their aspirations? That's very general, and it's not easy to do. The second thing I'd say is just follow the threads. I feel like every good idea that we've had started off as I use it like a spider web of a thread. The smallest thing, it's like, oh, maybe that goes somewhere. And you follow it along and it gets bigger and bigger. And then it becomes like a piece of substance of what it is to weave together the tapestry that is your business. And I mentioned Cassinia community, we're doing this refugee work. We had a public meeting yesterday effectively to start some groups to help sponsor some refugee families to come to our region. Similar to the model in Canada that's been around for a long time, Australia's just adopted that model and we're helping roll it out. And while there, I met a guy who works for the New South Wales Forestry Service running their whole drone program. And he's about to retire and he's moving to our area. We live in Victoria, that's the next state along, and New South Wales. And so I was like, oh man, there's so much to be done. Like there's so much potential for drones to do really innovative monitoring, restoration work. If we can deliver the algorithms that can identify species in real time, particularly in grasslands and prairies, like there's a huge opportunity. I said to him, I'd love to meet up with you and really understand what you've learned about drones within the New South Wales Forestry Service. Now, to me, that's like a thread. It's like a spider web line thread. Now, it may go nowhere, but it may be that we end up in 5 years having another chat and I'm saying, well, we've got this whole drone thing that's now doing restoration and we're using the drones in other ways. I could see that being a potential thread. So I feel like as an entrepreneur, you're always looking for these little tiny things that most people don't notice that lead to something else. And probably the third thing I'd say is you probably have 20 failures to every success, So it's like, oh, that didn't work. Well, that's all right. What's the next one? What's the next one? What's the next one? And we've got 4 or 5 successful threads now that make the tapestry of what Cassinia's business model is, but we've probably pursued 80 or 100 that if I go back through my historical emails, it's like, oh yeah, that didn't work. Oh, that didn't work as well. So yeah, there'd be my 3 bits of advice off the cuff. Get inside the head of people who are around you, who share your aspirations and find ways to solve their problems, follow the threads, and then it's a numbers game too, because you've got to try a lot of things. Don't be disillusioned or disappointed by a failure because that's just one more step on the path to a success.
Mm-hmm. I find it notable that the example that you gave of the drone guy, it didn't involve money.
No.
And so that seems to suggest that the way you see entrepreneurship, it's not just about business models that involve financial transactions. It involves kind of a way of being. Is that how you think about it?
Yeah, I think so, yeah. And everyone's got an interesting story and everyone's got a whole universe of their whole experience. It's as deep as rich as mine. And going on those journeys just could open up interesting opportunities. Being curious about people and being curious about what people's experience could offer in the long journey to people in nature flourishing, I think is the mindset to have. I'm excited to meet with this guy again and just see where that goes. I mean, there's a 5% chance it'll go somewhere, like if it's 1 in 20, but it's those things that open it up. And look, spending money is a fair way down the track, to be honest. You will, for every good idea to reality generally requires you to spend money. And the more money you spend, the better chances you've got of making it work. But I think they often get called low-cost probes. You do want to have this ability to play around with something that you don't bank everything on it, and you just see how it's received. Another one of our projects that we're interested in is native foods from tree crops in Australia. And we're like, that could be such a golden opportunity because if we could displace 1% of wheat production with cereal production, flour production from native tree crops, there would be so many biodiversity benefits to that 1%, and there'd be less carbon emissions associated with planting and just so many things. So we've leaned into this, and I have to say that I'm hoping that it's not going to be one of the 19, but we've spent a lot of money on that project now, and so far it hasn't yielded a financial return. We're still got partnerships with universities trying to find innovative ways to use the product, and we're still meeting with people who could potentially take that seed. But yeah, you don't want to have too many like that cost you a fair bit of money and then strike out, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, I'm taking this to heart because I think for so many of us here in the States, we may well have to really rethink the models by which we try to do this good work. So
But you guys are the most innovative country in the world. I so admire America. Like this whole mitigation banking market came out of the US, and you guys have done so many good things that we really look to. Like if there's an innovation or a new idea, a new approach, usually it comes out of the US. So I feel like you guys, I mean, I know it's a disruption, what you were talking about with government grants and whatnot, but I feel like people are pretty good at this ecosystem of entrepreneurship and innovation, and it'll be exciting to see what happens. Not that I wish this approach to precipitate it on anyone.
Mm-hmm. I think what you're saying is true, but I also think that in the States there might be a tendency to leave entrepreneurial thinking and innovation to the experts, those people who are branded as the entrepreneurs. And for the rest of us, unless there's a lot of pressure, we don't necessarily need to rethink the models that have worked good enough for years. So I'm really wondering if this disruption, as you call it, with the current administration's decisions, maybe in the end some good will come of it. Maybe in the end we'll come up with some more effective models akin to what you guys are doing.
Yeah, look, and maybe we're only a shadow of what we could be too if we had really got it right. But I think thinking about the business world compared to the philanthropic world, like there's a lot more money transacts in the business world than in philanthropy or in grants. And if you can set up a model that's robust and sustainable, what you're doing is so critical for fabric of all of life. You can build that into the economy in a way that's redemptive. That could be beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to touch on something you said earlier that, again, seems to be one of those things that makes Cassinia stand apart, and that is this connection that you make between human flourishing and nature flourishing. Sometimes in the broader conversations about caring for the environment, we hear the assumption that earth care maybe has little to do with people. And in fact, sometimes human presence is seen as the antithesis to environmental flourishing, that we're the problem, as often we are, but I don't know that we can define human presence as just problem. In contrast, I gather that the core of Cassinia's guiding values is this belief in a critical connection between human flourishing and nature flourishing. Maybe you could describe for us that dynamic and tell us a bit about how that shapes the essential work of Cassinia.
Yeah, I'd love to. A few thoughts come to mind. One is there's an idea in First Peoples of Australia, environmental wisdom and environmental knowledge that, and I feel like I get emotional when I think about this, but this idea that land is lonely without people is a consistent theme across many First Peoples cultures. And I think there's something true to that. I think people are essential to nature flourishing, not just that they do the work, but there's a beautiful relationship between people and land. And First Peoples talk about their country and like when they're home, they're on their country, their ancestral lands. And I feel like as a sixth generation farmer, I feel that same spiritual connection between land and me. Where I live is my country. So I think there's a human flourishing that happens when we're deeply connected to nature and to land. So that's my lived experience. That's First Peoples' ancient wisdom. And I think it just tracks well for all of life. So I would take that as a given. The second thing is if you create an artificial wall between people and nature, unless you've got loads of space, like people will break that wall down and do it anyway. And so there's been plenty of work done. You know, I did some work in Africa. I was working with World Vision for about 6 or 8 years, part-time, getting some projects off the ground in East Africa around biodiversity and nature. And certainly when governments would take the approach that we need to remove all the people and just let nature do its thing, people came back and still did what they were doing illegally. And when governments would take a different approach of saying, well, people have traditionally lived in this space and let's work with them to deliver the right outcomes for nature, you got a different result and a better result because people will still impact nature even though they're not supposed to. So it's better to work the symbiotic thing. And I guess the third thing that I would think is, and this is really hard for us because we live in this cultural milieu of more is better. And I think, Forrest, I'm talking to somebody who is pushing against that grain, but I think the means to an end that money used to be for human flourishing has become the end itself. More is better is the way we think. And I really feel like we need to push against that. I think people will flourish better with boundaries and with less. And when they're living in a symbiotic, they're nurtured by nature and nature's nurtured by people. Accumulation and more is not the goal. Human flourishing is the goal. And this is a hard thing to reframe that. But if we can reframe that and have nature in place as this welcoming home that God's created for people to live in, and get that framework right, and the accumulation of wealth be just a thing that we left behind, I think then we can really see people and nature flourish together. That's what society teaches us. You'll be happy if you've got more. You'll be happier if you've got more. So that's the one that's really, really hard to bend, I think.
Well, for both of the organizations I work for, Pacific Rim and Circlewood, we've come to understand that in order to understand the land, we need to pay attention to the deep stories of the land. And that story usually has an integral human element. So we've been taking time to listen to and learn from the Native American communities, especially in our region. And I do know that Cassinia has paid attention to Indigenous history in Australia. Maybe you could share with us about some of the ways that you're working with Indigenous or First Peoples?
Yeah, I'd love to. This is an aspiration that we'd have wherever we work. And across the sort of 70 or so properties we've got, we're probably working on maybe 20 different countries, like First Peoples country. So we do that better or not so better in different places. Where we live and work locally, we lean into it some more. But perhaps the story I'll share is one of my best friends is an Indigenous guy. His name's Clyde Rigney. He's the chairman of his nation's sort of legal entity. His people are Ngarrindjeri people, so they're at the mouth of the largest river system of Australia, and there's a lot of lakes and people of the land and water, I think is what Ngarrindjeri means. So we purchased a property down there in his country, and then we're working with him and his people and his mob, as they call themselves, and working to manage that property with them. And then we've just started the process late last year of actually gifting that land back to Ngarrindjeri, so it'll become a Ngarrindjeri land. And it's beautiful. There's all these lakes down there. It's a dry part of Australia, but we've got this big river system coming through. So you've got this sort of mixture of sort of semi-arid land amongst lots of wetlands. So it's a beautiful country. And I feel like that relationship that we've been able to build personally between me and Clyde, and as well as other people in his group, has just been a real walking together, real journeying together, learning from one another story. We actually went away for a week, my wife and I, just for a week off over Christmas, New Year, and we went away with Clyde and his wife and just spent the week on holidays together by the beach, which those sort of relational connections, I mean, isn't life all about relationships? We're either having a relationship with land or with other people, or with God. I think they're the three primary relationships. But to spend that time with him and to know a little bit of his language and a little bit of his way of thinking about the connection between people and nature is great. Just share one little bit of wisdom, and you might have seen this in a video, that because Clyde was in one of the videos that is on our website, but Clyde said, people think that land belongs to us, but we think we belong to the land. And just that little shift of like, it's not land that I own, it's land that owns me, is just a beautiful humility, which I think unlocks the door to the right relationship between people and nature. Yeah.
Yeah, that's certainly been the case with us as we have sought to work alongside Native peoples in the region. We have found that we ourselves have been transformed. The way we see the world, the way we see creation has actually been impacted. I mean, due to the generosity really of our Native teachers, we've kind of been invited into that new way of understanding. I mean, just to give an example, we've learned to think in terms of kinship with all members of what we call the family of creation. So when we see ourselves as part of the ecology of the places where we live, or as you put it beautifully, as belonging to the land, we also come to see the work of earthkeeping as really simply being a good relative to all our relationships, all our relations. I'm wondering, are there other ways that Cassinia as a community has been influenced by serving alongside Indigenous peoples?
Yeah, I think the shift in thinking about the way we relate to the land's probably been the most profound. And then the other thing, just having these real, genuine relationships, meaningful, personal, deep relationships is the way we learn and change and learn to love and understand. Yeah, I feel like it's never as scary as you think it will be. This is a bit of wisdom from Clyde. He said, we all know what we know. And apart from that, we don't know anything. We all know the little bit of what we know. And apart from that little bit of what we know, we don't know anything else. And so when we come into a relationship, we come with a whole bunch of assumptions and prejudices or biases, positive or negative. But when we get into deep relationship with real people, and I feel like First Peoples usually have a different way of thinking about the relationships between people and land, then we're just there to learn and to be changed and to be loved and to love and to enter into this different way of thinking. There's beauty and there's wisdom and there's nourishment that comes from building relationships across cultures. And we see that with refugees too. These are all beautiful, deep opportunities for growth and learning and love. And I'm getting emotional. I didn't expect to get emotional on this call, Forrest, but you've touched on some things that are really deep and really close to me. And I feel like when we're dealing with people who've been through trauma too, like some of the refugee stories, there's so much we can learn there as well. It's really good and beautiful. And First Peoples have got so much to teach us. Like, they were the first peoples here. There was something special about that. There's something significant about that. There's something intentional about that. Yeah, so let's go on a journey with them and let's build relationships. And as Clyde said, Australia's had this big sort of conversation about reconciliation in the last 2 years. And we actually had a referendum to change our constitution that failed, that would have recognised First Peoples as a specific voice to Parliament within the Constitution of Australia. So we had this big debate sort of before the referendum, and the referendum was about 18 months ago and it failed. But Clyde says, we're talking about reconciliation. He's like, reconciliation is just one point in time. And once you're reconciled, you're in a relationship. And when you're in a relationship, you need to know and be known. And so I feel like that's the challenge to most Australians is, how can you know and be known and understand the perspective and the actual person of First Peoples around you? Now, I'm privileged to have this beautiful relationship with one of the wisest people I know in this thing, but I think that's what we're called to really lean into, that opportunity to grow a relationship.
I appreciate your vulnerability, first of all, but also your acknowledgement of that fear. I think that sometimes keeps us from pressing into knowing and being known, especially by the cultural other, quote unquote. But I also appreciate your advice from experience that we do need to press into that, because that's where the real growth and transformation happens for everyone involved. And I think ultimately it has huge implications as well, reconciliation between people, for nature itself. Because I think that we learn to, again, see our relationship to creation in different ways. Well, I am sure, Paul, that you can imagine that this is a really discouraging time for us in the United States who care about the future of the planet. And I'm just wondering, in closing, what would you want to say to me and to our American listeners to the podcast that might help us hold the line in terms of our commitment to loving and caring for our places?
Yeah, well, wisdom from a farmer who was a good friend of my dad's. And this is just wisdom for life, but one of his favorite quotes was, things are never as good as they look or as bad as they seem. And it's true. Things are never as good as they look or as bad as they seem. And I know that there's so many people of good intention and good heart in the US that will come up with innovative ways to do good things in the face of what seems to be a pretty tricky situation. I guess that's somewhat of an encouragement for me, that there's always opportunities to do good when things are really tricky. This too will pass. I mean, I feel like the pendulum swings, and it feels like it seems to swing further each time at the moment. But God willing, there's an opportunity to really draw back and for people to take stock in this difficult time of, it's really important, and that's relationship with others and with nature. And it'd be a time of catalyzing, of engaging, of working together and finding humility to learn from others, to learn from nature. I think taking an attitude of humility, even in times like this, to the problems that we face and seeking to learn from trials that we're going through is just so valuable. I feel like humility is the key to flourishing. I started a PhD a few years ago in environmental philosophy, and I didn't finish it because I got busy with work. But that was the subject of my PhD, was like, what does humility teach us and lead us into a solid environmental ethic? And there's so much opportunity to humbly serve one another and humbly serve nature in this time now. I don't know, that's perhaps a little bit flowery and a little bit philosophical, but I think there's always opportunities to learn in humility.
Yeah, no, that's all good. I really appreciate it. It feels like just in this conversation. It just feels like you're standing with us and with me, so I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's been a real privilege to be able to share with you and to shed a tear as I do and to touch on these things that are so deep and human and connect us to each other and connect us to nature in ways that are real and tangible and the marrow of life. So, yeah, thank you, Forrest. I hope we connect again soon, either here or there or virtually like this.
We must do. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
We've been in conversation with Paul Dettman, founder of Cassinia, an Australian land management company whose mission it is to connect land, biodiversity, and people. For more information about Cassinia or any of the topics we touched on in this conversation, please go to this episode's show notes at earthkeepers.online. Earthkeepers podcast is a production of Circlewood, an organization that encourages people to pursue a more ecologically conscious faith. Our executive producer is James Amadon, and our sound engineer is Dave Olfers. Lana Rasmussen is our podcast editor, and Jesselyn Gentry is our social media coordinator. Forrest Reed is the composer of our original music, and I'm Forrest Dinsley, your podcast host. Thank you, friends, for listening, and I hope you'll join us again for our next episode of the Earthkeepers podcast.